Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Dome9 webinar this morning. We're going to give people a few more minutes to join, so you are in listen-only mode. Please give us a minute, and we'll be right back with you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Dome9 webinar, Better IAM Protection in an AWS Environment. My name is Thelen Blum. I'm the Senior Product Marketing Manager at Dome9, and I'm here with Patrick Pusher, our Technical Evangelist for Dome9. In today's webinar, Patrick is going to discuss how businesses can protect their AWS cloud environments from insider threats and ransomware using the powerful built-in IAM capabilities of the AWS cloud combined with an advanced IAM protection of Dome9 IAM Safety that provides just-in-time elevation of privilege with out-of-band authorization. Dome9 IAM Safety adds an extra level of protection to a cloud's native IAM capabilities to safeguard access to actions that can have a huge impact. IAM Safety is like sudo for the cloud, providing fine-grained control over users, roles, and permissions. We will close this session out with a Q&A at the end. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available afterwards. All attendees are in listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question, please type it in the questions window of the GoToWebinar section, and Patrick will address as many questions as possible, time permitting. Without further ado, I will now pass the ball to Patrick. Let's get started.
Thank you, Thelen, and thank you everyone for joining us. We really do appreciate about the next hour of your morning, where we will talk about really the role that identity and access management on public infrastructure as a service sort of platforms is taking, and ways that we can protect it. So to set a high-level kind of expectation for our webinar today, we'll talk a little bit about, again, the importance, the changing role of IAM within the public cloud, some of the common pitfalls, challenges that we see here at Dome9, some of the sort of industry-driven best practices to really tackle these challenges, and then talk to you about how Dome9 really offers IAM Safety, a security blanket, a firewall, if you will, for your identity and access management controls. And really privileged access in general. So to level set, let's talk about and really set that definition for what we mean when we say identity and access management within the context of this webinar. Really, in terms of an industry context, it is that security discipline that matches the identity of an individual to the the access to the right resources that they need. Traditionally, we've sort of stopped there. I think a more modern way to think about this is at the right times for the right reasons. We know that privileged access is a challenge in terms of offering, the abilities we need for our trusted administrators to be autonomous in their day-to-day activity, yet, we're conscious of the fact that privileged identities can be manipulated, can be stolen, can be compromised. It's this trade-off that we struggle with, and indeed is the basis for really the challenge that we're talking about today. Before we get there, let's talk about how we got there, and I think some perspective on how we used to do security versus now how we do it in this public cloud-driven infrastructure as a service environment. I think when we're thinking about the traditional data center and our firewalling approach, we're very happy securing the perimeter of our network, but then trusting what was inside it to a large degree. Not leveraging things like host-based security controls, right? Maybe we would have antivirus, maybe we would have some performance kind of or monitoring sort of agents loaded on those machines. But we would really, outside of the perimeter, we would really trust those machines to be secure given those perimeter defenses. Now in an infrastructure as a service sort of driven environment, we consume a very broad array of services from one service provider, right? Back in our data center, we would have our filer, our network core, our hypervisor. They might use centralized account databases, in a radius kind of way, but they were distinct services. Now we have one service provider that provides all of that for us. So think about it, one control plane. We're either using it kind of interactively at the console or we're leveraging the API, but it's one provider we go for absolutely everything. And that's a lot different. Never mind the fact that we secure things at the perimeter versus inside, but just the fact that now we have kind of one entity to interact with means all of the power concentrated in everything to do with identity and access management is in one place. And that's great for us, but unfortunately it's also good for those with less than perfect intent. They know they have one entity to interact with, to figure out, to solve, to hack, if you will, and they know they'll have the keys to the kingdom. And of course those keys are protected by identity and access management as a service from AWS. So, when we had this kind of edge perimeter gateway firewall kind of approach, our networks looked like this, and we would have an internal workload. One of the challenges, I think, when we think about security within a very dynamic environment, we know that this approach doesn't work. That internal resource, that internal VM, can become public itself, regardless of these gateways that we sort of trusted traditionally. So we know that the gateway approach no longer works. One small configuration change, sort of changing a privately addressed IP address, substituting it out and substituting a publicly addressable IP address, and that internal resources is now public, regardless of what you did at those sort of gateways. So now what we do is we think about these much smaller security controls wrapped around workloads in the concept of a security group, and maybe one security group will let traffic into a network and another will not, and we sort of segregate our networks this way. We have some private infrastructure that really should never be publicly addressable. They're in their own security groups that deny that traffic. Yet others, like maybe the security group wrapped around the load balancer, does have to be sort of permissive in a specific way. And so we break our networks up like this. And this way we know we have the control really out front of every single workload and service to be able to do that sort of micro traffic filtering. The challenge, though, with that is that you have a proliferation of security controls. No longer do you have one or two or three corporate firewalls. You have one wrapped around every type of workload, or even every workload itself. And this means the kinds of or the number of security controls we have grows. And then as we think of the flip side of that, not in number of resources, but in number of interests, a number of use cases competing for, the use of that infrastructure as a service platform, we suddenly have sort of many competing interests, right? We have different business units with different sort of maturity in terms of security at the cloud. We have automated kinds of management paradigms versus more manual at the console kind of administration. And these different interests and these different models really do beg a very growing access and permission model, a sophisticated one, one that supports many different sort of use cases. The result, unfortunately, is more complexity. So when we think about why this control plane is so appealing to those with malicious intent, I think it's easy to see, right? We've talked about how we've changed from managing maybe disparate sort of account databases and technologies to really speaking one language of the AWS API, and trusting all of our infrastructure needs kind of to one service provider, and even more than that, one control plane. Those on the other side know that as well, and so we see a variety of attempts or compromise vectors, if you will, in API key leakage. We have a note or a blog on our blog around a tool that will sniff out if developers have embedded API keys within their code. Obviously, a terrible practice, but one that we see still followed, and one that is often done for convenience. But people publish code with keys in them, and all of a sudden, of course, those keys to your kingdom are lost. And that use case, not necessarily the way those keys are leaked, but that use case of being able to compromise credentials is really what we're talking about today, right? How do we manage giving the access we need to our trusted administrators with high privilege, yet understanding that we're a credential compromise away from all that privilege being very much misused. These are some of the ways that we see that happen in the wild. So let's talk then what we can do from a high-level best practice industry-driven perspective, and then we'll talk about if there are still sort of gaps and how we address those specifically with Dome9. Certainly, we encourage the use or the retirement maybe of credentials that have too much power, and the root user is of course kind of the master user in any account, and we really recommend that you do not use that user, you do not use those credentials really ever. Create distinct IAM users that have the policy you need and just the access and policy you need, rather than the root user kind of having global authority really generally within a system. So make dedicated users and follow that least privilege kind of policy, right? Make sure you limit what those users can do tied to the functionality they need. Do this rights assignment with groups. Don't do it distinctly with each user. That is much more difficult to manage than kind of the more policy-driven approach where you build a group, you assign users that has that policy attached to that group. Much easier to manage down the road when you have to replicate, you have to sort of scale that security model. Configure a strong password policy. It goes without saying. What might be new is the kinds of things that make a strong password. We actually have a blog scheduled next week for the science behind password policy, and it's maybe a little bit different than you think. The key predictor in how strong a password will be, much more than any other, is length. It's not complexity. It's not do you have special characters in your password. It's length. Even in terms of readable password, it's length. And so some people sort of incorrectly assume, based on a lot of the common password policies we see, that it's kind of a combination of unreadable characters and case and special characters, and actually it really does come down to password length. Much more detail coming in the Dome9 blog around that, but make sure that your password policy, first of all, that you have one, and two, that it's best practice driven and widely enforced. Removing unused security credentials, certainly when employees leave, making sure there is no sort of straggler accounts tied to real permission that people aren't using. Of course, they are ripe for credential compromise, so make sure that those are sort of dealt with in a timely manner. Use IAM roles to share access. So rather than sharing credentials, which we know isn't a best practice, we know when we do this, we share them in all sorts of insecure ways. Rather than do that, create distinct IAM users for everybody, but maybe use roles for those users which may have, the need for common access. Maybe I have a web administration role that, I will let my users assume once they're in the console, and that will give them the common permissions they need based on their job function. Right? that is certainly, that way you have both accountability from an individual user perspective. We don't have a bunch of users sharing credentials and not being able to distinguish between them all, but you also still regain that ability to scale your security, saying I want you to use this predefined role rather than give you sort of distinct privileges, where I might err in that distinct privilege kind of negotiation on every account. A role-based approach will certainly be much more consistent and more secure for those reasons. And then lastly, of course, use MFA. Kind of a no-brainer. It's well supported within AWS. For those interactive use cases, make sure MFA is turned on. So talking a little bit less about best practices, more about detection and containment. What are those things we can do? Let's assume something fundamentally terrible happens in our AWS efforts in terms of an identity compromise. How can we contain, just how bad the consequences of that sort of thing will be? First, make sure you have the forensics turned on to know exactly what somebody with abusing that kind of privilege is doing. Enabling CloudTrail to make sure that we have a footprint of what that user has done, during that credential compromise event. We talked about a little bit in the last slide. Follow that principle of least privilege. Make sure that we are doing this sort of distinctly to users or groups, and following, not giving them more privilege than they need. We tend to sometimes do this in order to simplify our lives day to day. However, from a security perspective, it's a terrible principle, and we're going to talk about why it is in just a moment. Restrict privilege access further with policy conditions. We talked a little bit before about, how this idea of identity and access management is more than just, providing the right access to the right users to the right resources, but it's at the right time and at the right reasons. And I think, if we begin to think of credential and privileged access as maybe something that doesn't have to be done full time. I don't always need to go and do those most sensitive things like deleting that S3 storage bucket. I will have a need to do that from time to time, but I don't do it every day. Do I need that privilege all day long, every day? Maybe I don't. And so this is part of the sort of the mindset, the design philosophy behind IAM Safety and with Dome9 that we'll talk about in just a moment. And then lastly, and this is a contentious one, people know this is a best practice, use AWS accounts to segregate between dev, test, and prod. Why we do this, of course, is we get 3 or more, depending on how you do this separation, sets of credentials that then sort of have different sensitivity of data tied to them. Now if I have a compromise event on one set of credentials, it's not across all of my dev, test, and prod efforts. Likely it's against, if it's kind of a base level compromise, it's against my dev environment, which I might have opted to not secure quite as much as my prod environment, but now at least I have that segregation, and one compromise doesn't give that attacker access to everything I do. The flip side of this, and why it's a bit controversial, is that it introduces a lot of complexity. And I think organizations struggling to utilize the cloud efficiently in the first place struggle even further when now they have sort of 3, let's call them 3 semi-separate implementations that they have to manage security across consistently. That becomes, it's good for security, it becomes an operational challenge. And to do this in a secure and consistent way becomes tough, and this is a different, this is something Dome9 is very purpose-built to address in an area that we're not going to talk about today, in a non-kind of IAM safety way, in a more generalized network security way. And maybe I'll show you just an introduction to some of what Dome9 does on this side, on the network security, and maybe the compliance side. I might give you a short introduction to that if we have the time. But, this is a best practice that transcends security operations, really any perspective, but there's some complexity on their side, and Dome9's purpose-built to address that. So at this stage, rather than show you this slide's kind of built for when we do this presentation without the luxury of doing a demo. That's not the case here. We're going to jump into the product. So let me pause my screen, and I'll get that loaded up. Okay, So welcome to your Dome9 dashboard. I think before we get into IAM Safety, really the subject of our webinar today, let me explain to you what Dome9 is at a higher level. Dome9 really is a security orchestration platform purpose-built for public infrastructure as a service environments. Namely, the environments we support today are Amazon Web Services and Microsoft Azure. And we will have support for the Google Cloud sort of platform in the product soon. Beta support has started for that. Really with the vision of being this security management platform that will transcend any one particular public cloud provider and give you very unique perspectives into security control data that isn't different than you'll find from the respective consoles of AWS, Azure, and Google, but presented to you in ways that aren't intended maybe to be a control interface, but intended to be an understanding interface, right? With tools like Clarity that give you that Visio diagram, visual sort of representation of potential traffic flows. Being able to dig into a network and illustrating the relationships between networks, even being able to dig into a particular VPC or VNet, depending on the nomenclature of your sort of chosen or preferred infrastructure as a service vendor. The tool works the same whether you're looking at an Azure network or AWS network, soon Google network. And what we're doing is saying, look, these are your security groups. We're ranking them in an exposure to the outside sort of way, giving you this traffic flow analysis ability so that you understand where traffic's permitted to flow, just as importantly, where it's not, right? Where traffic can't flow. Can traffic flow from the outside public internet at large to my database servers? Well, no. You know right away, because they're in this internal zone that the Dome9 has classified it in, you know that traffic from the generalized outside public internet cannot make it to your database service. So that's the kind of feature set you'll find on the network side, network security side rather, of Dome9. So too will you find a comprehensive way to measure your infrastructure you manage with Dome9 against a desired baseline, either an established baseline or a baseline that you build using what we call the governance specification language. It's a way to define these rules with a non-developer skill set, right? With things like rules like show me all of my instances that have been launched from a set of pre-approved AMIs on AWS. This is what the rule looks like. Very, very simple. And even if you don't know the language, you're able to go in and sort of be coached through the process of building rules using what we call a rule builder. All of that just to tell you that Dome9 is much bigger than what I'm about to show you and the subject of our discussion today in identity and access management protection. But IAM Safety is certainly a key capability that, to be honest, came about after our focus on network security. Our customers came to us and said they love this fundamental perspective on securing concepts. The kinds of entities we protect are security groups, VNets, or virtual networks or VPCs, NACLs. Those are the kinds of entities that we extend with visibility, allow you to manage. Our customers love that, but they said all of that fundamental perspective won't matter if my credentials are compromised or if somebody's able to log in and delete those efforts. Never before has that been possible, where you can log in from a software service and say kind of delete all of my RDS instances or encrypt all of my databases and hold them for ransom, right? As our customers became more educated about the power of that IAM kind of capability within AWS, they wanted it protected, and they demanded it, and we responded with IAM Safety. And so let's look at what IAM Safety kind of looks like from an interface perspective, and we'll go through an example of it kind of in use in the wild here. So the process of considering how to use IAM Safety begins with you thinking about those rights afforded to us by AWS in the IAM model that would be very disastrous if kind of in the wrong hands, right? If I was able to steal your credentials, what wouldn't you want me to be able to do? And the answer when I ask that question is anything. But remember, the horse has left the barn here, right? I've got your credentials, I've logged in. Dome9 IAM Safety is an additional safety net once you really have no more to protect you in an event like this where credentials have been compromised. Kind of that responsible perspective of security where I do everything I can to not be compromised, but what happens if I do? This is where IAM Safety really fits in the problem space. So think about these things, and I often give the example of deleting an S3 bucket, right? This is the kind of thing that, yeah, you're going to have the need to do from time to time, but can you imagine somebody being able to log in as you and delete, the storage that your application depends on? That would be disastrous for your app. So, and ultimately, I guess if your app is centered on AWS for your business. So, think about those kinds of things. Deleting a bucket is sort of table stakes. This is something that if you're a storage customer, you would likely choose, and you'll find a lot of those in the templates up top here. We don't expect you to start from scratch. IAM from AWS is extremely granular, and that means lots and lots of control and lots of potential to get fine-grained in your policy. The flip side is that it can be a little bit overwhelming in terms of everything you can do. And so for those use cases, just know that this is not searchable only by service, it's searchable by operation. So if I put delete, I'll get 235 matches of all the delete operations with an IAM, and that's a very powerful search. So know that it's powerful, and you can get to sort of the services you use and then the operations within those services very quickly. So do that across everything you consume at AWS. Think about these capabilities that you would never want in the wrong hands. And this is called your restricted policy, and that is step 1. Step 2 then, Dome9 will have cataloged all of your IAM users and all of your IAM roles. And it's up to you to decide, do you want to apply this restricted policy kind of per user? And you can do that as you scroll down per IAM user. Or do you want to do this kind of as a blanket policy across everybody? And I would position that if these rights are sensitive enough to be protected against any user or role, they're sensitive enough to be protected across your organization. So the Protect All button gets a lot of use. And when you click that, you'll be taking away all of those rights that you put in that restricted policy away from these users and or roles. Right? And so the next question is, well, if I take them away, then how does anyone do them when they're needed? That's really where the sort of magic of IAM Safety comes in. You're going to pair up each user that you trust to be able to do these things, like the deleting of an S3 storage bucket that we talked about in our last example, with a Dome9 application. And this application is necessarily out of band from a workstation perspective. It's available on both iOS and Android. And that application will let your trusted user elevate their rights for a short period of time to gain access to what you put in that restricted policy, in our continued example, deleting that S3 storage bucket, and then provide them the time to be able to do that, and then when they're done, fall back down to that day-to-day less privileged state where they didn't have access to delete that bucket. And I'm sure if you're following along by now, you understand the intent is that if we do have a credential compromise event, it's going to be at that less privileged state. We've taken away these sensitive rights, yet we've given our trusted users a very, very self-service driven way to gain them back. One that doesn't impede them really at all. Right? It's the quick elevation of rights using an out-of-band mobile application. Do that sensitive work and fall back. So they're not, their day-to-day workday, yes, is impacted briefly by the need to elevate, but it really isn't. It isn't a sort of a demanding kind of process to follow. Yet now, at every turn at a credential compromise event, if somebody, heaven forbid, is able to log in as us, they will not have access to the most sort of sensitive features as defined by you and capabilities afforded to us by AWS. So let's have a look at what this looks like in practice. And first, let me take the perspective of somebody who is just logged in as you. Whether that's been a kind of socially engineered credential compromise, more of a technology-based man in the browser, session hijack. Regardless of how we got here, I am the attacker, and let's say I know time is of the essence, and my job is to create havoc in your account. Maybe I'm trying to demand a ransom. Who knows? What I want to do first is route your traffic from where it's supposed to go legitimately to an imposter website I've set up. So first thing I'm going to do is go and try to manipulate your DNS. Let's go there. And you'll see that I don't really have the access to do anything. I can't go in and list my hosted zones. I certainly can't manage them. I've got no access to anything, and that's because this customer or this user that I've attacked is an IAM Safety customer, and they've put everything to do with Route 53 and DNS administration on AWS in their restricted policy. So now, day to day, even their privileged users that I've been able to compromise their credentials cannot perform these actions. So let's flip back now to the trusted use case where I'm coming in as the administrator. I have some legitimate work to do. I've just prevented really a credential compromise disaster. The first thing that my attacker tried to do is go in and redirect traffic from legitimate destination to something that they manipulate, and they weren't able to do that. They weren't able to do that because my administrator put everything to do with Route 53 in the Dome9 IAM Safety restricted policy. So that means I too, as a trusted user, when I go to do legitimate work, I get the same sort of problem state where I don't have access. Yet, it's not really a problem for me at all because they also paired me up with my IAM Safety application. And this is my trusty Android simulator. And I'm going to go ahead and launch Dome9 IAM Safety. And you're going to see an analogy here to something like sudo or su. And often we call Dome9 IAM Safety the sudo of the cloud because there too, when I'm working under Linux, or it's similar to UAC under Windows, when I try to do something sensitive, the operating system sort of re-asks me for my password, saying, "Are you sure?" And of course, this is an audited event, and my rights, become elevated, and I do that sort of action. And if I do an SU, I get a whole shell with much more access. I do that sort of action, and then over time, I'll fall back to that less privileged state where if I do another sensitive thing, I'll be asked for my password again, right? In a sudo or su kind of way. You're going to see an analogy here where, I come to my Android or iOS device, I elevate my rights. You can see that it's probably small on your screen. I have a 15-minute interval now of where I can where I have this privilege, and I can come back to the AWS console, click reload, and realize that privilege immediately, right, within the AWS console. Do the work I have to do, the legitimate work I have to do now, of course, and in 15 minutes, or if I'm security conscious, when I actively hit the stop button, I will fall back down to that less privileged state, right? I no longer need the ability to change my DNS settings. Why would I have it attached to my user full-time when I don't need it? I might only come in and do DNS manipulation, as is quite common, very regularly, maybe not even once a month, yet I carry with me this privilege all the time, meaning, I am ripe for if there is a credential compromise event, I have all this privilege that I don't even need. I need it, from time to time, but full time I definitely don't need. So why have that risk associated with your users? Strip back that privilege day to day, and really only deliver it in a just-in-time sort of fashion. That's the concept and principle behind Dome9 IAM Safety. One of the things that's really, really nice sort of about the service is that if I visit the Dome9 audit trail, I will find every instance of when a user attempted to use this functionality, elevate their rights with IAM Safety, right? So now I have a full account of each user, when and what functionality they were looking to do. So it's a very, very it goes hand in hand if you know the other side of Dome9, the network security side, where we do a bunch of network security control monitoring enforcement. It goes hand in hand with that, kind of this source of network security intelligence where when somebody tried to use a very sensitive service protected by Dome9 IAM Safety. And in fact, this audit trail you can use here within the product like you see me do, but you can also take into your favorite sort of SIM tool of choice, your Splunks, your Sumo Logics, your even your on-prem sort of a SIM tool. So know that this data is yours. Getting it out of Dome9 into any sort of log aggregation or custom alerting tool set you have is very, very straightforward. So with that, let's just position back to our presentation. We'll wrap up, and if there's time for questions, we'll do that as well. I should mention, if you look just down in your GoToWebinar control panel, we do have a handout called the Dome9 IAM Safety Product Brief. Please feel free to download that. It's got a lot of the summary of what we've talked about today, but also probably a little bit more information on even how to get started and evaluate Dome9. And by now, this is a review, but really, you know, due to the way IAM safety works, what we're doing is we're finding a way to contain the blast radius over a very kind of scary credential compromise session hijack kind of event. That previous to utilizing Dome9 IAM Safety might have been, and in many times has been, history has taught us, kind of organization altering, right? If we think of a code spaces kind of event where somebody was able to come in and compromise at that critical control plane layer, they're able to effectively hold data for ransom and delete data, right? Many people even manage their backups within AWS. Not a bad practice, but if you're doing it in a way that shares keys or has sort of bleed over from security controls of production or dev test to your sort of DRP site, you are blending security controls, and without knowing it, you are extending what we call the blast radius of an event like that. And so IAM safety, because the users work day to day sort of with less privilege, a credential compromise event no longer becomes business ending or catastrophic, if you will. We're limiting the kinds of things that party who comes in and is able to hijack or compromise their way into privilege really can do. And the best part about it is that it's up to you to define what the riskiest privileges are, right? There's no assumptions on the Dome9 side. You're going to use the policy editor to define these and even mature these over time. As you use more and more services from AWS, you may want to come back and revisit kind of what's in that restricted policy, and that's a very, very straightforward process. So really containing that blast radius of the worst case scenario, if someone is able to compromise their way into your account, how do you prevent that from being a catastrophic kind of business altering or ending kind of event? So today we've talked about IAM protection. It is one of several things that Dome9 really focuses on. I gave you a bit of a teaser intro into some of the things, clarity visualization and our compliance and governance modules. We do a lot more, and we do it for more platforms. So we urge you to come and take a look at really all that we do. We have regular webinars at dome9.com/webinars, as we do have many, many learning resources on the web for Dome9. And I think that's it for the slide and sort of demo presentation, but I think we do have a couple questions. Is that right, Ellen?
Yeah, it does. It looks like we have a few. The first one is, isn't multi-factor authentication enough to protect my users? What does IAM safety do that MFA does not?
Right. This is not surprisingly, it's a question we get often, where I think people think that MFA is sort of the full stop of security, and certainly it's a key capability when we think about multi-factor authentication, not relying on just password credentials or just one set of credentials, but relying on more than that. And multi-factor introduces the ability to obviously exponentially increase the security of our credentials, of our ability to log in and access the rights associated with our account. It provides that second factor of ensuring that we are who we say we are. The challenge, I think, is in how MFA has evolved kind of over the years. It's one of the reasons we chose to make the IAM safety application necessarily out of band, kind of not usable on the PC itself, is that we've seen MFA be compromised. We've seen, because MFA has become an industry standard, network of vendors try to make the usability of MFA more attractive, easier, and now it's pretty simple to go to a language like Audit and script the ability to watch somebody typing in their master password into an application like Authy, right? type their master password in, harvest information from that application. Because it all works on the workstation sort of plane, if you will, compromising MFA is easier than ever. That's one of the reasons you can't operate the IAM safety elevation mechanism on that workstation control plane, right? And we feel like MFA is sort of in that bucket. It's not something you would ever not want to utilize, but just understand that it's got its own limitations, and that even scenarios where you might have a workstation at work, somebody is pre-authenticated to the AWS console, they're working away, even using MFA, their attention is stolen, they move from their workstation. That's a vector of compromise, and it's an insider threat kind of example of a compromise, but a vector nonetheless. And we think, again, with the amount of power kind of focused in that single control that's being protected, we think it's one worth thinking about and worth protecting. So don't think of IAM safety and competing with MFA. Think of it as the last safety mechanism. When even the common ones you're utilizing are compromised, it's another layer of protection.
Okay, thank you. We have another one. The next question is, when I use IAM Safety, do I now have two permission models, both AWS and Dome9, to maintain?
Yeah, that's another good question, and I probably should have mentioned it in the description of IAM Safety, but absolutely not. The IAM Safety does not compete with the original, let's call them the organic rights that you are issuing within AWS. So you're building your IAM policies, you're hopefully granting rights to groups and assigning users to groups to inherit those rights. All of that is observed within IAM Safety. All you're doing with IAM Safety is you're taking rights away. What you built in that restricted policy is what it sounds like. You're restricting. You're taking those rights away. So day to day, let's say that my trusted user had the right to delete that S3 bucket. That right has to come from the policy you assign at AWS. You're not granting anything with IAM Safety. But if they do have that right, you're taking it away with that restricted policy. So if they did have the right originally, you take it away. If they didn't have it originally, well, yeah, you still take it away technically, but you're not doing anything on the back end, right? They didn't have it, they don't have it with IAM Safety. But if they did have it, you take it away and you force that path of elevating with the out-of-band, just-in-time IAM Safety application, utilizing that functionality, and then falling back to that less privileged state. So the answer is no, they are not distinct authorization models at all. Think of Dome9 as that second factor of authorization working in combination with the native policies you build at AWS.
Okay, and we actually have another one. How does IAM Safety benefit those companies that use SSO/SAML and roles where there are no or very few users created in AWS IAM?
Yeah, good question. So when we're federating identity, we're still matching those identities to capabilities afforded to AWS. You may not be doing that based on user accounts, to your point. You may be doing that based on roles. And roles are very, very popular when SSO or federated identity are kind of in the mix, because all of our users coming in are defined, not within our local account database, but federated to somewhere else. Yet we still have distinct capabilities afforded to us by AWS that that rights model over there won't understand. So we're matching credentials or identity to abilities. And so you probably noticed through the webinar we talked about the user kind of protection case, but there was a column there for IAM roles as well. So if you have users coming in either assuming roles or being tied to roles, we can protect those roles as well. Just like a user, when that role might have had the ability to delete that S3 storage bucket or to manipulate DNS, we're going to restrict the rights of that role using IAM Safety, and you'll have to elevate just like you do in the sort of per user use case. So it's no different. Maybe how you set it up is just a slightly different on the way in, but we'll protect roles rather than distinct users, kind of in that use case.
Okay. And I have another one here. Is a 15-minute time frame default standard? Can it be changed?
Yes, the answer is yes and yes. It is default, but it can be changed. So the 15-minute you'll see in most of our demos because it is the default, and it provides you, enough time to go in and do something meaningful. Yet we don't think it's kind of over provisioning time in sort of most use cases. So yeah, you can pare that one back from 15 to something much smaller if you'd like, or extend it further.
Okay. And the last question we have, if an account's credentials are compromised and the account is allowed to elevate permissions in Dome9, what controls are in place to limit damage?
So I think the question is if somebody can compromise an account and elevate their rights. I mean, that's the whole basis of the solution, right? If someone was able to compromise credentials and somebody knew the passcode to the phone and could pair up the IAM Safety application to the Dome9 account, if we make an assumption that they could do all of those things, then they can elevate their rights as well. Dome9 will certainly record all the IP addresses involved in the exchange. But if you're able to sort of compromise everything in that chain, of course, then you can compromise the account. However, the idea is that the reason again that the elevation mechanisms are out of band is that really reducing the possibility of this case. You'll never hear me say never. To me it's a responsible securities practitioner perspective to not say ever, but we're trying to make the potential of that kind of a event by introducing other factors, out of band factors that are operated in just in time kind of fashion, and other factors that are already protected by things like biometrics and pins on mobile devices, right? Remember, how this mobile device works will likely be governed by your organization's mobile policy as well. So there's a lot of assumptions in what has to happen for somebody with less than perfect intent to sort of compromise a system like this. But if they are able to do all of those things, then there is some additional tamper protection with IAM Safety. Let's say they compromised everything and they wanted to strip out IAM Safety entirely from your account. There are some tamper protection features that will prevent that from happening. If you're familiar with the network security side of Dome9, tamper protection is nothing new for us. So if somebody goes in and tries to change, let's call sort of the scaffolding that IAM Safety sets up to be able to do what it does, network alerts will be sent out from Dome9, and that will be prevented from happening at the AWS side. So know that that's the case as well.
Okay. Well, that's the end of the questions folks had. So thank you, Patrick. All right, everyone. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for attending. If you have any further questions on the information presented today, please don't hesitate to reach out to us via the email at q&a@dome9.com. I have a few final notes. If you enjoyed the webinar presented today and would like to experience the Dome9 ARC platform for yourself, we are offering a 14-day free trial. Please go to our website at www.dome9.com and click on the Get Started button on our home page. Just register and a representative from Dome9 will contact you to activate your free trial. Additionally, if you liked the webinar today and would like to hear more about the public cloud security solutions Dome9 provides, please visit the resources page on our website and sign up for several of our upcoming webinars. If there's a topic you would like us to discuss, please contact us through our website and let us know. With that, we thank you for your time and hope you found the content informative. This now concludes the Dome9 webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.